No one expected him to step through those ropes. The old man had been sweeping the gym floor for years, his faded blue overalls stained with cleaning solution, his hands calloused from pushing a mop instead of throwing punches. His name was Clarence, but everyone just called him Mr. C. He moved slow, talked less, and kept his eyes low, as if he'd learned that blending into the background was safer than being seen. That night, the air inside Iron Grip Boxing Gym was different. It smelled heavier, charged with sweat and anticipation. The Friday night sparring sessions always drew a small crowd, fighters, coaches, and a few locals looking for entertainment. But tonight, the talk wasn't about the young amateurs or the rising star on the heavy bag. It was about a newcomer, Eddie Lights Out Carter, a cocky 24-year-old with knockout power and a mouth to match. Eddie had been mouthing off all week, bragging that he could knock out anyone in the building in under 2 rounds. It was all fun and laughs until his eyes fell on Clarence, mopping the far corner near the ring. "Hey, old man," Eddie called out, grinning as the room turned to see who he was talking to. "You ever lace up gloves before, or you just here to clean up after real men?" The gym fell quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Clarence didn't answer right away. He kept mopping, slow and steady, like Eddie's words hadn't even reached him. But then, without looking up, he said quietly, "I've laced 'em before." Eddie laughed, tossing his towel over his shoulder. "Oh yeah? You think you could take a punch from me? Tell you what, get in here. 1 round. I'll go easy on you." The coach, trying to diffuse the tension, chuckled nervously. "Eddie, knock it off. Clarence ain't here for that." But Eddie pressed, his voice louder now, feeding off the few smirks from the younger fighters. "Come on, what's the harm? Just a friendly spar." Clarence finally stopped mopping. He leaned the handle against the wall and turned toward the ring. His eyes, usually so tired, carried something different, something sharp, like steel catching light. "If I get in there," he said, "I don't want you to go easy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the kind of man anyone pictured in gloves. He was wiry, maybe in his late 50s, with graying stubble and a slight limp in his left leg. His boots were worn, his work shirt faded, but there was something about the way he stepped toward the ring, measured, deliberate, that made the noise in the gym fade to a low hum. The coach sighed. "Clarence, you sure about this?" "I'm sure," Clarence replied. They lent him a pair of old gloves from the supply bin. The leather was cracked, the smell of decades-old sweat clinging to them. As he slid them on, his hands moved with muscle memory, like they'd done this more times than anyone could guess. Inside the ring, Eddie bounced on his toes, grinning at the absurdity of it. "This'll be quick," he muttered to one of his buddies leaning on the ropes. Clarence just stood there, gloves up, eyes locked on Eddie. The bell rang. Eddie came forward light and loose, throwing a lazy jab, then another, testing the waters. Clarence didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Then, out of nowhere, he slipped the 3rd jab and tapped Eddie's ribs with a short right hand. Not hard, but placed with surgical precision. Eddie froze for half a second, surprised. The crowd murmured again. Eddie's grin faltered. He came in faster this time, throwing a left hook. Clarence's head moved just enough for it to miss, and his counter, another quick, precise shot, landed square on Eddie's body. Eddie stepped back, shaking his head like it was nothing, but his eyes gave him away. No one had ever seen Clarence move like that. His feet were quiet on the canvas, his timing uncanny. Every punch Eddie threw seemed to meet empty air, and every time he missed, Clarence's glove found a target. It wasn't about power, it was about control. The kind of control that only comes from years of doing something over and over until it's a part of you. By the end of the 1st round, Eddie was breathing heavier. Sweat ran down his temples. Clarence still hadn't thrown a punch to the head, only to the body, measured, disciplined, almost like he was teaching. Between rounds, the coach leaned in to Clarence. "You're making him look bad out there." Clarence looked at him calmly. "No, he's making himself look bad." In the 2nd round, Eddie came out swinging harder, pride stinging. He landed one glancing shot to Clarence's shoulder, but Clarence didn't back up. He stepped in close, weaving through Eddie's punches with smooth, efficient movements. Then, with a short combination, left to the body, right uppercut, he stopped Eddie in his tracks. The gym went silent, except for the sound of Eddie's breathing. He stood there, gloves half lowered, eyes wide, the sting of reality sinking in. Clarence didn't press the advantage. He stepped back, gave Eddie a moment and said quietly so only he could hear, "It's not about hurting the other man. It's about knowing yourself." When the bell rang again, Eddie didn't rush forward. He just stood in his corner, staring at Clarence with something new: respect. What no one knew was that 30 years ago, Clarence the Ghost Mason had been an undefeated middleweight contender, known for his defense and his heart. But an injury, and a tragedy outside the ring, had taken him away from the sport before he ever fought for a title. He never told anyone at the gym. He didn't need to. Now, standing in the ring with a young fighter full of ego, Clarence wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting to remind the kid and maybe himself that the measure of a man isn't in his power, but in his discipline. And as the third round approached, the crowd leaned in, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. The bell rang for the third round, but the energy in the gym was different now. It wasn't just a spar anymore. Everyone could feel it. This was something heavier, something that carried the weight of years. Eddie's swagger was gone, replaced by a cautious respect. He circled slowly, trying to read Clarence, but Clarence didn't rush. He stood in the center, gloves up, eyes steady. Eddie feinted a jab and stepped in with a right cross, but Clarence slipped inside, catching the younger man's arm and pivoting away. It wasn't just skill. It was like he could see punches before they came. Eddie reset, threw a flurry, and again Clarence glided through them, weaving low, his counters tapping Eddie's ribs and gut with perfect rhythm. The crowd was quiet now, no cheers, no taunts, just the sound of gloves brushing air and the dull thump of leather finding flesh. Even the coach stopped pacing. He leaned on the ropes, his eyes narrowed, as if he was starting to recognize something he'd seen before. Then it happened. Eddie threw another wild hook and Clarence stepped inside, planting his feet. His left hand shot to Eddie's liver, folding him halfway. And before Eddie could breathe, Clarence's right uppercut snapped his head back, not enough to knock him out, but enough to stop him dead. The gym seemed to freeze. Eddie's gloves dropped to his sides. He took a step back, then another, and finally leaned against the ropes, sucking air. His chest rose and fell, but his eyes were locked on Clarence. There was no anger, no humiliation, just the realization that he'd been in the presence of someone far beyond him. The coach stepped between them. "That's it," he said softly. "We're done here." Clarence nodded, pulling off the gloves slowly. The room remained silent, watching him. He climbed out of the ring and set the gloves on the apron. Eddie followed him with his gaze, still trying to put it all together. "Who are you?" Eddie finally asked, his voice rough. Clarence stopped. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he looked over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nobody," he said quietly. "Just someone who's been where you are." But the coach, Old Man Harris, spoke up, his voice carrying across the gym. "That's not nobody, kid. That's Clarence Mason. They used to call him the Ghost." A ripple of whispers spread. Eddie blinked. "The Ghost? Best defensive middleweight I ever saw," Harris continued. "Could make you miss by an inch and make you pay for every mistake. He walked away undefeated." Eddie's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at Clarence, who was already back at his mop, cleaning the same corner as if nothing had happened. Later that night, after the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, Eddie approached him quietly. "Why'd you stop?" Clarence kept mopping, his voice calm. "Life's not just about what you can do, it's about what you can walk away from. I had my reasons." Eddie hesitated. "You could have embarrassed me tonight. Why didn't you?" Clarence stopped, leaning on the mop handle. His gaze was steady, not unkind. "Because one day you'll find someone younger, faster, stronger, and if all you've got is pride, you'll lose more than the fight. You fight to learn, you fight to grow, you fight to leave the ring a better man than you entered it." Eddie swallowed hard, the lesson sinking deeper than any punch could have. I get it." Clarence's faint smile returned. "Not yet, but you will." The two men stood there for a moment, an unspoken respect between them. Then Clarence went back to work, the mop gliding across the floor, the sound echoing softly in the quiet gym. As Eddie left that night, He glanced back one last time. The old man was still there, moving slow, eyes down, not because he had to, but because some people don't need the spotlight to prove who they are. Years later, Eddie would tell the story to anyone who would listen. Not about the punches, not about the skill, but about the man who could have broken him, yet chose to teach him instead. And every time he told it, he ended the same way. It wasn't the fight that left the crowd silent. It was the way he carried himself after it was over. Sometimes the loudest lesson comes from the quietest man. If you felt this story, subscribe to Black Saga for more powerful, real stories that stay with you long after they're told.